sort out alternate arrangements. And I cannot remember exactly how the information about the cause of the cancellation became public knowledge. But when it did, it spread quickly. The initial irritation grew to full-on outrage. The cause, the driver of a loading vehicle, had driven into the side of our waiting plane. Our plane now had a hole in it. And given that most airlines don't keep spare planes ready to fly, just hanging around on the tarmac, the airline personnel really didn't have much choice but to cancel our flight. People streamed to the ticket counter in great distress, expressing urgency, worry about their lost connections, and outrage at the stupidity and gross negligence of the driver. You can imagine ticket counter personnel were typing frantically into their computers. Passenger voices were raised. Physical gestures of frustration were evident. There were hands in the air, hands that were shaking, faces animated in distress. And it seemed that the general assumption was this: the person driving was either on drugs, on his phone, or otherwise doing something stupid. And I could feel all that energy. It was in me, too. So I found a safe place for my older kids to sit and draw, hiked the baby onto my back, and got in line with all the other people. And as I was standing in line, I listened and watched for a moment. It was definitely a strained situation, and the tension was palpable. I could feel my own heart rate accelerate, my anxiety mount. I was worried about how I would manage the flight connections with 3 little kids, but also my travel arrangements at my destination, since the original plans were clearly going to be ruined. And then I again observed the frantic efforts of the ticketing agents. So I began to tell an alternative story. Wow, a hole in the plane. The poor driver. I hope he or she's okay. I wonder what happened. I hope they didn't have a heart attack or a stroke or something. I hope he or she didn't get hurt from the crash. Geez, I bet that poor person just lost their job. And also, look at those poor ticketing agents. They're sweating, they're trying so hard. That's amazing that they're figuring out so many new routes for so many people so fast. And slowly, as I began to challenge the original narrative of blame and judgment in my mind, my tension seemed to ebb. And as I began to speak this other narrative, I believed that the collective tension seemed to ebb. So certainly some of this was the result of passengers realizing that we were being given new routes that would ultimately get us to our destinations, albeit in somewhat different time frames. So that surely helped. But nevertheless, there's also no doubt that the trip ultimately ended up more complicated, a lot longer, and somewhat more arduous than what I had originally booked. But that moment in that line, I decided 2 things while I was standing there. Whatever the rest of my travels were going to be like, I didn't want to compound the stress by generating stress through the intensity of my reaction. And the folks at the counter had had absolutely nothing to do with poking a hole into our plane. And they were doing their very, very best they could do to accommodate our needs and to honor their company's contractual agreement. It just felt wrong to shout at them or expel our frustration at them. and it certainly wasn't going to make them work any harder. They were doing their humanly best. Many months later, I had a lengthy discussion about this event with another person. Started off as telling a humorous story about a hole in the side of a plane. And this person is someone with a great deal of professional experience in industrial kinds of settings where many people work together in complicated tasks and where safety is of constant and crucial importance. They explained to me that in the vast majority of accident cases, the cause is indeed some moment of negligence, carelessness, or forgetfulness. In other words, they explained that the assumption that everyone was making of fault on the part of the driver is almost certainly the correct or accurate explanation for what happened that day. So I want to pause and come back to that. Hold that, please, just a moment. First, I want to shift completely and tell another story. When my boys were little, my eldest came home from school one day and proudly brought home several small bean plants in little individual containers. And they had grown them from seeds to this stage at school, taken all their data, and were now encouraged to watch them grow some more at home, just for the joy of discovery. We found a good spot in our house, set them up, and explained to the younger brother, who was not yet in school, all about the plants and how he could help water them, and so on. Everything went great for 3 days. On the 4th day, while I was making breakfast, my eldest howls in astonishment and distress, "My plant! It has no leaves!" Sure enough, one of the plants was nothing but a bare naked stalk. The leaves were gone, and not even on the floor. I wonder what could have happened. So there was really only one plausible explanation. So I comforted my eldest and assured him that it's indeed very frustrating and sad to find a leafless plant, but that we would try to plant a new one if that mattered a great deal to him. We could do that. But now, for the culprit. I thought, and I thought, what was all that about? My younger son was certainly old enough to understand and know that what he had done was not okay. The evidence for this? The leaves were well hidden. They were behind the trash can. Not in, behind. Very clever. So I thought about my strategies and my goals for this situation. So my goals were teach that it's not okay to break other people's things, find out what prompted him to do that, figure out how to teach him to handle that impulse more constructively, teach him to have some empathy and consideration for others. That was all I could think of at the moment. I thought that was plenty. My strategies, so what could I do? I could tell him what I want him to know about each of those things. I could ask him what he was thinking and for his reasoning. Why did you do that? I could yell. I could make it outstandingly clear that you are not allowed to be destructive. And I can firmly state the rules of our home about respect and compassion. And I decided that none of these were likely to help me meet my goals. Not at this time, with this situation, and with this kid. I needed something else. And that had to start from a place of complete empathy and compassion within me for the perp. To touch the compassion in me, I had to first tell a different story in my mind than the "you little stinker" story. So I took a deep breath and gave it a whirl. So, did you pluck the leaves because you were angry about something? No, I didn't do it, was what came back. Okay, so that didn't work. I tried again. I wonder if you plucked the leaves because you felt jealous, and so you kind of acted out that yucky feeling? No, I didn't do it. Using the word jealous, I probably should have known that wasn't going to work. So I tried again. I wrapped him up in my arms and snuggled him close and said, "Okay, sweetheart, I think I understand now. Were you feeling sad that your brother's at school all day and you're home and you miss him? And then he gets to do neat stuff and you don't get to do it with him?" Yes! Wow. So here finally came the blessed, beautiful release of tears that told the truth of his pain. He felt alone and missed his brother. Haven't we all felt alone before? Doesn't it hurt? Do we handle it well? Are we then at our best? I'm not. So, in that moment, and with the recognition of his sadness, our anger melted. And the older brother consoled the younger brother. The one who was hurt first understood the hurt of the other. And when that happened, something shifted. So we hugged, and we snuggled. And I believe that the something that shifted was a genuine sense of connection and understanding. The little boy couldn't tell his story. He didn't yet have the words or the skill. And to reach the healing and to reaffirm the relationship, we had to tell a better story than the story of judgment or blame or punishment. We had to start with a story of compassion. So let me go back, excuse me, for a moment to the story about the plane with a hole and the mad ticket scramble. I fully understand that the correct story about what happened that day may very well have been one of carelessness or negligence of some kind. But my point in telling that story is not about figuring out what was the right story or what was the accurate event description, but instead, what was the most helpful story for me during that experience? Because in that moment, there was no way for me to know which was the right interpretation. So I got to pick one. I truly could simply choose the narrative from which I would operate. What story would help me to remain kind to the agents who had nothing to do with the accident? What story would help me to stay calm despite my own anxiety about the rest of the trip? What story would help me teach my kids patience and compassion? And I decided that the answer was to try telling a better story than the story of judgment or blame. Please understand that there's no doubt that there are situations of injustice or abuse in our world that sometimes require a strong response. And there's no doubt that there are times when we must name or address circumstances, systems, or actions that harm others. Absolutely, we must. But my point is that in much of our everyday lives, we can have a surprisingly powerful impact on our daily well-being and that of those around us if we practice telling a better story, a story of compassion. So I have one more story to share. And this is a story about a lesson that was hard learned many years ago in my time as a social worker. I'd been working as a social worker for several years when I began a new job at a women's shelter and crisis center. And there I completed a lengthy training on the special circumstances and needs of the women and children they serve. And one notable piece that stuck out was the importance of never blaming the abusive partner when speaking with the women. We wrestled with this quite a bit in our training hours. And my position at the time placed me in the county courthouse where I was to help women obtain legal protection orders. And once my work began, it didn't really take long for this situation to come up. The first time that I met with a woman who was so battered that she was literally leaving a trail of blood in her wake and was leaning carefully on the walls of the hallway as she was making her way, I could not keep from crying. It was gut-wrenching. So we met in my office, and she told me what happened. And she cried, and she cursed her partner, and she said she wanted him punished. And she said she would leave and never go back. And I validated her feelings, and I worked to support her efforts to move towards safety and freedom. And in the social work parlance of my pre-crisis center training, I joined with the client, and that term is supposed to connote meeting the client where they are. So that's what I thought I was doing. I didn't understand. Now I know that by joining her story of blame, I ensured that I was not someone she could confide in again in the future. How could she come to me the following month to ask for help when she'd been back with her partner not long after our meeting? How could she face me to explain that decision after I'd clearly made a strong negative judgment about her man? Almost certainly, seeing how willing I was to judge her man, she had good reason to believe I would at some point be willing to judge her. So I learned a hard lesson. I learned that I did not need to enter her story in order to join her in her need for understanding and compassion and hope and real tangible help. I learned that I can validate her feelings and her experience and her needs without telling a story of blame. I learned that it's possible, and better for her, for me to say, "Oh, honey, you are hurting right now. How can I help you get safe?" And to leave blame and judgment out of the narrative that I reflect back to her. And while I certainly did not and would not now accept or condone abusive behavior in any way, by refraining from joining in judgment of the human, I can far better offer compassion and understanding to the person before me So this is a social worker's reflection, right? A social worker's lesson. But I told this story because I think it's more than that. I believe now, having learned, and continuing to learn, that this story is equally relevant in so many situations in all of our lives. We hear a story of injustice or abuse, or perhaps even just simply someone's hurt. So I invite you to hear it as that, a story about how judgment disempowers and how compassion can empower. Back to my client. I now know that by offering empathy without judgment, I empower her to choose her own story about her partner and her choices. She decides how to narrate her experience, and she decides how she will proceed. And by focusing only on supporting her, not on blaming or judging the abuser, not her, for staying with him or returning to him, I make it possible for her to feel safe to find me again in the future if she needs me. She doesn't have to worry about being ashamed or of having failed or disappointed my expectations. And really, what in the world business would my expectations have inside her experience anyway? They just don't belong there. So by refraining from blame or judgment, I can help her to feel, to truly be the author of her own life, her own story. And I can cheer her on, and I can support her. Support is eroded or weakened by blame and judgment. Support cannot include condemnation, I believe. So it's not easy, and I know that everybody understands that social work can be a tough job, but again, even though that's a social work story, I think the idea is equally true and relevant in our personal lives. Can we hear about others' pain and stay compassionate? Can we stay willing to simply be present and not enter a story of condemnation? And for me, what was tough was the clarity that I needed to cultivate inside of me in order to be helpful to someone else. So when I want to rant about what one person has done to another, I have to pause and remember that while it may be true, in some sense, that so-and-so is a horrible SOB for whatever they've done, it doesn't help to stay with that story. It doesn't aid my ability to be helpful, and it doesn't facilitate empowerment in the other person. And when I want to rant, I have to remember that even if I only rant in my mind, but carefully censor my spoken word, almost certainly my judgment and my desire for punishment or anything else will leak out through my body and my eyes. Maybe some of you are better actors than me. But what I need in order to be truly helpful and to cool my own inner thirst for judgment or punishment is to try to tell a better story. So I try to tell a story of compassion. So back to my example, compassion for this woman, because I may very well have had thoughts, right, to be really quite honest, about why in the world are you with this person? Why in the world have you stayed this long? Why have you gone back? Compassion has me see things differently. This woman loves someone who is important to her. That person hurts her. That's not easy. And it doesn't have to be this dramatic. We can see the parallels in much smaller ways in many of our lives. Also, trying to tell a story of compassion as I think my way through my situation, that abusive man was once a child, an itty-bitty little child. like the ones we have in the other room. And really, with extremely rare exceptions of a very particular psychological nature, children don't just grow up to be vicious without experiencing viciousness or profound pain. And if any of us are a child of God, then that man too is a child of God. And while he must be stopped, right, and the hurtful behavior cannot be permitted, his journey toward healing and wholeness, if it's going to happen at all, will begin somewhere, sometime, with someone who will offer compassion, despite everything. So please understand, I am not suggesting that people should not be held accountable for harming one another. What I'm saying is, even while we do that, we can also have compassion for one another's humanity. So, telling a better story, a story of compassion instead of a story of blame or judgment, can be a deliberate choice. Literally, we can just choose a different narrative from which we operate. And sometimes a story of compassion has more to do with enhancing our own ability to navigate a situation with a little more grace and a little less stress. Like my airplane scenario. And it really can begin with a simple questioning of the previous story. Is that really true? What if it isn't? And maybe it just doesn't matter right now who's to blame. Sometimes a story of compassion may be more about deep, deep connection and figuring out what is at the root of a situation. Telling a story of gentleness and compassion may offer a kind of profound safety and recognition that facilitates a healing and a connection that can be really quite radical. And it just requires a tiny little small willingness to entertain the possibility that the other person has a real and wholly understandable need. And that once that need is acknowledged and addressed, connection can be reestablished. And sometimes telling a story of compassion helps us to be just truly present for another person. Blame is quite simply divisive. Compassion breeds connection and understanding. We are better helpers when we are compassionate. Those of us in the human services are better counselors, social workers, therapists, teachers, ministers, or healers if we are compassionate. And I believe always we are better people when we can tell a story of compassion instead of a story of blame or judgment.